You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of Indications, a podcast series by the Conference Board. Indications are conversations that take an objective, fact-based look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business executives. I'm Sara Murray, Managing Director International of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast. Today's conversation will focus on the Ukraine-Russian situation, HR crisis management in action. To set the scene, we will accept as many refugees as will be needed, Poland's Deputy Minister of Defence said 3 days before Russia invaded Ukraine. More than 1 million people have since fled Ukraine amid the Russian invasion, and over 500,000 of them have sought refuge in Poland, one of the 4 neighbouring countries that's a member of both the European Union and NATO. All neighbouring EU countries have pledged to accept Ukrainians, in contrast to previous refugee crises. And data from the UN Refugee Agency shows that Hungary, Romania and Slovakia have also accepted refugees. Our guest today is Anne Stevens, who is Council Director at the Conference Board for our Global CHRO, HR Executives and Global Business Women Leaders Council. Our councils bring together senior executives together to learn from one another, share issues and exchange for solutions. Today, Anne is going to share what CHROs from leading multinationals are doing to take care of employees affected by this crisis. HR is at the forefront of this now, clearly. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So how are companies helping staff and families to get to a safe place or relocate to another European country?
So I think the initial reaction has been very swift. It's been a very emergency-based response. I think once people got past the shock and emotion of what's actually happening, things have started to move very quickly. So there are a number of companies that I've been talking to who have actually quite a way down the path in terms of their plans. So, for example, companies are helping employees wherever they can get out of the Ukraine and are providing and trying to provide transportation, accommodation, financial support. They're working very hard to get where they can their employees and their families out of Ukraine. Important to say, though, that of course it's mostly the women and families who are leaving, and the men, of course, have to stay because they are expected to be enrolled into the army. So that's one thing. I think practical supplies are proving an issue. I did talk to a company yesterday who is actually getting some assistance from the Ukrainian police and the Ukrainian government to go in by road to take emergency supplies into their employees. But I think the key thing is that actually helping people with some financial support is also very important. So companies are bringing forward salary payments, end-of-year bonuses. They're providing interest-free loans. And of course, they're providing credit with their relationships with in terms of travel agents and hotel agencies and organisations as such.
And how are they managing to track them, Anne?
Well, I don't think it's been that easy for everybody. Some organisations have very sophisticated emergency response systems, and others, I think, have worked very hard to ensure they know where everybody is. And in fact, one of the challenges has been finding responsible individuals, is probably the wrong word, but relevant individuals on the ground so that they really can map where everybody is. And that's been one of the biggest challenges in the early days, for sure.
And you mentioned that a lot of the women and children, not necessarily the employees, but the families are being the first to be moved. So anything about support for the children?
So I think there's a huge psychological issue here, of course, because families don't want to be torn apart. But I mean, undoubtedly, families and women are, in the main, are the people that are being moved out of Ukraine. In terms of children, they are actually looking at psychological support, not just for children, for the whole family online, but also remote schooling and remote learning. So what they're trying to do for the children, because obviously schools are all closed anyway, is they're trying to provide some sort of infrastructure or some sort of framework where children can maintain some level of normality and some level of learning. It varies by organisation, Sarah, but I've seen 2 or 3 who've actually got that set up and running now, which is very, very important, of course.
And impressive at how quick as well.
Yes.
And what about staff who have to or choose to remain in Ukraine?
This is an interesting one because the message I'm getting is that many people don't want to leave Ukraine.
Mm.
So depending on where they are in the Ukraine, I mean, obviously people in the West feel slightly less threatened, I guess, but there are families there who've been through previous conflicts. There are grandparents, parents, and obviously children. And I'm hearing that some of the older Ukrainians do not want to leave the country, and therefore that is encouraging people, younger people, to stay with their parents and their grandparents. So it's quite interesting. However, there are some people who don't have a choice. As I said earlier, it's mostly women and family members who are able to leave the country because most men are being expected to join the army or the military. But there is another issue evolving around the LGBTQ population. And I heard just this morning that actually, in particular, transgender women are unable to leave the country because if they go to the border with their passport, which still states that they are a man, they will be expected to sign up and join the army. So their safety will be really threatened. So there's another issue emerging there. Literally just heard about that this morning.
Gosh. And can companies, relocating staff to other operations in Europe, what kind of questions about work visas, I mean, the situation's changing so rapidly, but what about that?
Well, there's a couple of things there. I think the first thing is the EU has actually said it will provide temporary work permits for all Ukrainians across the whole of the EU, which is marvelous because it means people can work elsewhere, and that's obviously what a lot of organisations are focusing on. And I think the other key thing is that there are many employees outside of the Ukraine who want to help their colleagues. So there's this huge solidarity, unity, created throughout organisations where people are going to the borders to meet their colleagues. They're meeting them at the borders. They're taking them to temporary accommodation that organisations have rented, so either hotels, apartments, or whatever is possible. And I think that's been a really powerful movement, I think, within a lot of organisations where the rest of the organisation is looking at Ukraine and also looking at Russia, of course, and everybody wants to help. Everybody wants to do something to help. So I think that's been one way of helping people sort of move through from Ukraine to a new work environment as and when they can.
Hmm. And what about expats in Russia? Monitoring the situation, contingency plans or deciding to recall them?
Do you know, in the main, most of the organisations I've talked to have already put their operations on hold in Russia. I mean,
Hmm.
there are several reasons, but I mean, I think there's a couple of things here, aren't there? First of all, it's about the safety of the people. So I think a lot of organisations preempted what might come. And so they've already started moving their expats out. And I think most have gone now. Most of the organisations I'm talking to, they've actually moved their expats out. But obviously, they'll keep monitoring the situation. I think there's another issue around getting supplies and equipment into Russia because of
Hmm.
because of the airspace is all closing down. So there are some very limited routes. I think there's a huge amount of uncertainty building around sanctions, around inflation. All the international schools closed some time ago. So I think from an expat perspective, it made sense to move people out. But then, of course, you get onto the conversation about existing Russian employees, which, of course, is a whole different set of challenges for organisations.
And when you think also about the Russian operations, many companies will have to take the decision, and some already have you said, about, closing temporarily or closing on a more permanent basis. What are some of the hard decisions that companies will have to make, or that they're talking about? For example, how long are they going to keep paying their staff, and how do they address worries about their jobs, especially when with the inflation and the value now of salaries?
Yes, of course. And I think, well, the sense that I'm getting from organisations is that they are monitoring the situation
Hmm.
and they have decided in the main right now to carry on paying people, certainly for the next month or two, maybe possibly 3 months. I don't think there's one hard and fast timeline that everybody's sticking to, but certainly the intent is to try and support their employees as best they can while their operations are suspended. However, we will all find out, I'm sure, at some point and get more of a clear sense of how long this conflict is likely to last. And there are various scenarios, of course, that people will be working through to make plans. And I guess, if the worst comes and this turns into a very long a long conflict and, effectively a Cold War, for want of a better word, then, organisations will have to take some tough decisions about closing plants and letting people go. It's a very, very sensitive situation, and it's evolving day by day. So I think this is exactly why HR is at the forefront of this debate, because they need to be very clear about how they're going to manage their people, not just in Ukraine, not just in Russia, but elsewhere in the world, in the context of what's happening.
We've talked about how companies are helping staff and families get to a place of safety, practical matters such as salaries, medical support, schooling for children. What support is provided to those who remain in Ukraine and expats in Russia. We've talked about Russian operations. Next, we'll look at emotional tension between Russian and Eastern European staff, helping employees who are feeling anxious and hopeless, and company communications in a time of crisis. We're going to take a short break and be right back with more of my conversation with Anne.
Interested in more insights on the current Russian-Ukrainian crisis? Visit our geopolitics hub at conferenceboard.org/topics/geopolitics. Here you can find a range of easily accessible insights in the form of webcasts, podcasts, research briefs, and more. New resources are being added regularly to help you lead with confidence.
Welcome back to Indications podcast. I'm your host, Sara Murray, Managing Director International of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Anne Stevens. So Anne, hearing about a build-up of emotional tension between Russian and Eastern European staff, how can you handle this? How can you amplify company values, especially around inclusion, tolerance, non-discrimination at this difficult time?
Yeah, and this is a very tricky one, of course, for virtually every organisation, because they are trying very hard to stay neutral rather than, try and get into any type of political statement. So there are several things here. I think, first of all, we do have examples in some organisations where Ukrainian employees report into Russian leaders. So that is clearly providing a lot of emotional tension, at the individual and the organisational level. So that's one thing that needs to be addressed. And I think some companies are already looking at changing reporting lines for exactly, the reasons we understand. I think there's also this pressure around the rest of Eastern Europe, some of whom, of course, have been through previous conflicts and are looking to their organisations to make very clear statements about what's right, what's wrong, and what their position is. And I think at this stage, certainly of the HR leaders I'm talking to, they're much more focusing on promoting the safety of all employees, promoting the well-being of all employees, promoting the sort of psychological support and the inclusion of all employees at this time. But it is difficult because there is pressure coming, no doubt about it, from some countries. Poland is a great example. Slovakia is another one, where they are asking their organisations, in some cases, to make more definite statements about the conflict. And I think it's a very fine line that organisations have to tread. But again, we will monitor this situation as we go through it. But I think as an organisation, you have to be very clear that everybody is valued equally, irrespective of where they happen to be situated.
And I think like that what you were alluding to is many, members from our member companies are wanting management to name it as an invasion.
Absolutely, and of course, I think that's very sensitive ground. And I think at the moment, most of the HR leaders I'm talking to that represent, pretty big organisations are doing their utmost to stay as neutral as they possibly can.
And what about other employees? I mean, not necessarily in Ukraine or even in the neighbouring countries, but many are feeling very anxious and perhaps helpless. How can companies provide support or some practical ways to help? What are you hearing?
Do you know, there's some great stuff going on. I mentioned earlier on about, the solidarity and the unity of sort of organisations and employees. But I think on a global basis, organisations are seeing employees all around the world want to help the people of Ukraine. And in some cases, I've seen organisations offering to match donations. So huge amounts of money being raised. And the question is then, where does that money go and how do you get it into the Ukraine? lots of things around clothing, children's, and babies' requirements, lorries going into Ukraine, or to the borders at least, to try and get these goods to Ukraine. So I think what organisations are doing is trying to make as much, if you like, trying to help employees as much as they possibly can feel that they're adding some value and doing something practical to help. I think the other thing is around support. Employee assistance programs, psychological support for people who are anxious or worried about this type of issue. Many organisations have already switched that on. It's an ongoing program for many companies, but they particularly focus now on this psychological support for people who are anxious about this particular conflict.
And how to keep, communicating to staff the company position, so that, as you said, the first set of messages is straightforward. We're prioritising the safety of our employees, but some employees, especially in Poland and Hungary, want stronger announcements, want to understand the company's position. We're asking, why are we still doing business in Russia? Why aren't we condemning, the situation? That's only going to get louder and louder. So anything else that you've heard in that regard?
Yes, and I think that's a very accurate description of exactly what's happening already, Sarah. And I think you're right; it will start to grow. Many companies have stopped operating in Russia. Certainly they've put things on hold, and they will have to take a decision longer term about whether they do restart or they don't restart their operations in Russia. So that's one thing. But I think the other thing is, it's very clear that there are some countries or employees in countries that want the company to come off the fence, if you like. They want companies to make an announcement and say something. But what I'm sensing is that whilst organisations are trying to stay at the moment sensitive and neutral, they are also starting to scenario plan. So they're starting to plan for different types of outcomes. So, is it going to be a short war? Will it be a short war with sanctions? Could it go to a very long war with extreme sanctions? All of these things have been seen in history before. So there are, if you like, precedents around which organisations can start to plan. And I hate to say it, but at some point, organisations will have to make much stronger statements, not necessarily condemning Russia, but saying very clearly about what their intentions and their plans are. And I think that will start to evolve over time. I think, we're still in very early days. This crisis is moving by the day, as we see in the news. But I think organisations will have to come out with a clear statement. And to be honest, honesty, I think employees want honesty. We've seen through the pandemic that employees now have a much louder voice, even before this crisis. This whole employee activism thing around who I work for, where I work, when I work, has come much more to the fore. And I think the same expectation around how organisations deal with this situation will be there.
Yeah. And any final comments or observations from what you've heard from members?
Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is this is an extremely complex situation, and it's moving pretty quickly. And I think, we will continue to see things change day by day. I think the other thing that struck me is that, having come through the pandemic, which was clearly a people crisis, the HR leaders in organisations have really been at the forefront of decision making and strategic planning. And this is just another example, I think, of where HR leaders really are critical to the success of most organisations, and in particular to the success of managing a workforce in such a difficult situation.
Indeed, as you say, evolving situation, and also very challenging for, our CHROs to try and do stuff from outside of the country as well.
Of course.
So it's very interesting days. Thank you for joining us and providing our listeners with a roundup of insights on the state of the situation and how HR is in crisis management mode. And thanks to you for listening into the Indications podcast. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by experts to provide insights on this issue. Please share the Indications podcast with your colleagues. It can be found on tcb.org/podcasts. I'm Sara Murray, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.